My partner Sal and I are lucky enough to have just been up north and were struck yet again by how wonderful it is to be in landscapes that are still fundamentally intact in many ways, with First Nations people still managing much of the country, with large apex predators in abundance, lots of diversity, and intact ecosystems at the scale of the whole of Victoria. And it's incredibly inspiring, but it of course makes one reflect when you come back to Victoria, and Paul touched on this really neatly, about where we're at. We basically are living in a state that is sick, with most of the biodiversity indicators ranked as poor in the most recent State of Environment report. And as Paul again touched on in his talk, missing entire vegetation groups, fauna groups and functions in our landscapes. And there's continuing pressures on all that remains because, as we know, much of Victoria has already been cleared. And I am always struck by Paul Ehrlich's wonderful analogy of the ecosystem as an aeroplane and species of rivets that hold the plane together. And in particular, you really want to hold the wings together, so he describes those as the sort of functionally important species. And when we think about rewilding, we want to make sure that we can keep that plane flying. We don't want to lose any more rivets. And so for the trust perspective, working at property scale, we really want to keep common species common. We want to keep those species that are still abundant enough to continue to contribute to ecological function and to diversity and to all of the other values that we all obtain from nature. And from Trust for Nature's perspective, working primarily on freehold land at landholder scale, we have to think about what actions we can take as individuals that we think make meaningful differences to ecological outcomes. And just touching on why we think it's so important that we keep common species common, it is this relationship between the abundance and diversity of organisms and their capacity to actually sort of make a meaningful difference to the ecological outcomes and functionality of nature. So when we think about rewilding, it really is at that fundamental scale of how do we help the next, how can we take action to help another generation of animals and plants survive and thrive? What are the actions we can take at the local scale, but also ramp up to the landscape scale? Oops, where did I go there? Sorry, I missed one somehow. Anyway, like Paul, when I think about the actions we can take, I'm shaped, I guess, by thinking about trophic webs and trophic complexity and how we want to restore all of those different levels of complexity and the interactions between them. But we also need to think about demographic processes. So what are the pressures preventing organisms reproduce successfully and the young to grow into maturity and raise the next generation. So this is a set of principles that Trust for Nature developed a couple of years ago. This was mostly in response to requests from landholders about what actions could they take to mitigate climate change at the property scale. But in a way, these same set of principles are relevant to thinking about rewilding because ultimately I see the two as being the same. We're just trying to sustain nature in the midst of increasing pressures. So I'll just take us through these and give some examples both at the local and landscape scale. So the first one is really this fundamental one about reducing key pressures on habitat and populations. And there's many. Again, Paul and Daniel touched on them elegantly, and Nushka talked about over-herbivory earlier in the day. Over-herbivory is a huge issue, really limiting reproduction and recruitment of many of the plants through the central Victorian landscape. And this is just an example of one of the 12 exclosures Sal and I have on our covenanted property, And these are only about 20 by 20 metres in size, and just give some examples of the changes we've sort of achieved with those. And many of you will know there's this sort of notional figure of how many individuals do you need to have enough genetic diversity to sort of withstand change, and it's sort of between 500 and 1,000 individuals. So you can see that for some of these plants we're sort of moving towards those numbers. And coming back to Nushka's point about sometimes needing temporary exclosures because they can all also grow up, and the biomass can actually sort of start causing declines in diversity, so we've just begun using these netting enclosures that we can take down at speed. Following on from Nushka's talk, she and her colleague Ryan kindly let me reuse this slide, which is just a summary of the impacts of florivory by a range of different herbivores on a range of different orchid species. And you can see that for Diurus chrysiopsis, 46% of all flowers are being taken by herbivores, with particular eastern greys and hares and swamp wallabies being culprits. So these small-scale actions we can take on our property to just keep these plants going, not just orchids obviously, but these are just examples of ways in which we can boost and maintain these populations and storehouses of genetic diversity. Oh, that's an interesting outcome. Sorry about that. So Paul and Daniel have talked about thinning, and again it's a critical action to reduce moisture stress and encourage more diversity in the understory. Oh, I see, something tricky's happened there. So we'll move on to another pressure that's been talked about today, which is impacts of noisy miners, a hyper-aggressive native honeyeater species which have been found to have large negative impacts on woodland bird diversity and abundance, even when noisy miners are present at densities as low as 0.6 birds per hectare. So there's been a recent meta-analysis published from 46 removals around Australia, broadly showing that reductions in noisy miner numbers will lead to positive outcomes for woodland birds. And the graph on the right just shows an example from a local reserve, Balmatum Nature Conservation Reserve, which is a bit over 200 hectares, and you can see over time we increased the number of woodland bird species, but across that reserve we calculated that we suddenly had more than 2,000 individual woodland birds that were able to use that habitat as a result of the noisy miner controls. So across much of our landscape, you can look at eucalypt-dominated remnants as often being vacant habitat because of noisy miner competition, and it's an effective action under permit to improve and rewild them. So moving to predator control, and we touched earlier in the day with a panel discussion about how difficult it is to do effective predator control across agricultural landscapes and across freehold land for obvious reasons. But I just wanted to give an example of how beneficial, obviously, as we all know, feral predator control at scale can be for some of the species we care about in central Victoria. So these are results from Puckapunyal Defence Base, where they initiated an intensive fox control program in the mid-90s until about 2006. And as you can see, they got dramatic responses from stone curlews, brush-tailed phascogales, goannas. And interestingly also, it's not shown up here, brush-tailed possums began feeding for at least 25% of the time on the ground, and these are an animal that are a fungivore, also doing some sort of soil disturbance. So you sort of have those types of outcomes. At a more local scale, which is a scale I think that's relevant to private land, this is the results of a fox baiting program in a 110 hectare predator-proof enclosure in the Little Desert, where they were able to show increased occupancy by goannas within the safe haven compared to outside. So there are opportunities, I think, to undertake effective predator control programs on private land. but limited. So moving to the second principle, which is really about targeting more productive areas for restoration. And I apologise, I'm not sure why so many of these have twisted around. We'll have to figure that out. But broadly, in a drying climate where moisture is driving plant growth and plant growth is driving ecosystem health through the trophic web, we really need to focus our efforts on the more productive places. And these are places that have been preferentially cleared already, and so it's critical that we sort of invest effort in those remaining places for our restoration and rewilding efforts. So I'm going to move on because these are getting tricky to read as they keep turning upside down. So these are again just some examples of the importance of productivity at a local scale, where we get higher flowering in the gullies compared to the ridges in box ironbark country, and we have higher bird species diversity and density in the gullies. The third principle, and Paul and Nick earlier have already talked about the importance of vegetation structure, vegetation diversity, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but just to say this is really fundamental to maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. But a fourth principle is, this is very peculiar, I have to say, Chris, I have just shuffled around. A fourth principle is just around the importance of protecting irreplaceable features. So these are features that are still at high risk of loss. There should be a photo of a nice meadow up here. But meadows, scattered trees, and large trees, all of these features, if we lose them, they're gone forever. And so wherever they occur in the landscape, we should focus our effort on these. In the last 30 years, using the Time and Land Cover series from DECA, it's estimated that we've lost 100,000 hectares of scattered paddock trees across the state of Victoria. So wherever we have clusters of large trees, we really need to hang on to them. So moving to the final principle, which is about taking a landscape approach, we've done some work at the Trust trying to calculate what a minimum viable population size is for some of the characteristic species found across these landscapes. And from that, we've identified 18 focal landscapes across Victoria where we think we have the best opportunities for maintaining and enhancing biodiversity, particularly on private land in the context of climate change. And so using that framework, we have these focal landscapes, we have a methodology for identifying refuges within them which are more productive. We have examples like the Little Desert Safe Haven Sanctuary, where refuges of 100 hectares or so are still generating more goannas than outside. And we know that at a small scale we can provide safe havens for plants. So putting all of this together, I can envisage a program where we identify which landscapes need refuges and trying to set up these small predator-proof sanctuaries within each of those, but also getting benefits across the wider landscape through landscape control. So this is a model specifically around fox control that Jessup et al. Developed in a 2021 restoration paper. But one can think about this kind of model of having these quite small-scale refuges within large landscapes where we want to focus our conservation efforts overall, and encouraging spillover into that wild, larger landscape of both plants and animals. And of course, none of this matters unless we make sure that our efforts endure. So on private land, I can't emphasise enough the role and the importance of permanent protection through conservation covenant agreements as a way of enduring a legacy into the future. Thank you.